They called her Belle Gunness, but history remembers her by another name whispered with dread hell's bell, a woman who built her kingdom not from soil and sweat, but from blood and fire. Imagine this. The year is 1908, LaPorte, Indiana. Smoke curls into the sky as a farmhouse burns to the ground. In the ashes, investigators find bodies, 3 children, and a woman without a head. They assume it is Belle, but the truth, as it always does, writhes in the shadows. The corpse is too small, too light, too conveniently missing the head that could prove her identity. Was she dead, or had she staged her own disappearance, escaping into the fog of history to continue her work in silence? Tonight, we are not just telling the story of a serial killer. We are peeling back the blackened skin of America's hidden past, where institutions fed on tragedy, newspapers turned murder into spectacle, and the machinery of power protected the very monsters it pretended to expose. Belle Gunness was not simply a killer, she was a mirror reflecting what society allowed, covered, and even secretly applauded. You see, murder alone is not what makes this story forbidden. It is the unanswered question: who helped her vanish, who profited from her crimes, and why were her victims reduced to fragments of flesh tossed beneath the hooves of her hogs? What you are about to hear is not history for the faint-hearted, is history designed to break the chains around your eyes. And if you stay with me, you will never look at trust, loyalty, or love the same way again. Because this is not a story about Belle Gunness escaping into the night. It is about how corruption lets evil not only survive, but thrive. So I ask you, are you ready to enter the graveyard of hidden truths? This is Belle Gunness, the widow who buried her victims in the backyard, a descent into shadows. And once we begin, there will be no turning back. The fire was only the beginning, a curtain of flames concealing more than it destroyed. Investigators at the ruins of the Gunness farm believed they were uncovering tragedy. But what they unearthed was something closer to ritual slaughter. A harvest of human lives buried in shallow depressions across the property. Imagine the scene. Men digging into the earth, striking burlap sacks with their shovels, the stench of rot rising as if the ground itself exhaled secrets. Inside those sacks, they found torsos hacked apart, arms severed from shoulders, legs cut at the knees, skulls caved in with blunt force. This was not random violence. This was methodical, repeated, perfected. Belle's farm was not just a home, it was a slaughterhouse for the lonely and the hopeful. Men who answered her marriage ads with dreams of love and prosperity, only to be stripped of their wealth, butchered, and fed to the soil beneath her hog pen. But here is where the story twists. How does a woman in 1908 lure dozens of men across state lines, collect their money, and vanish their bodies without raising alarms? How do trunks pile up in her home, fur coats and pocket watches left behind, while neighbors and lawmen dismissed the disappearances as chance? Either the world was blind, or someone made sure it stayed that way. This is the first hidden truth. Belle Gunness operated not as a lone wolf, but as part of a wider web of silence and complicity. Newspapers painted her as tragic, a mother dying heroically in the flames. Insurance companies paid her out again and again, despite the suspicious trail of fire and death that followed her marriages. Lawmen investigated, but always pulled back before she could be indicted. Was it incompetence or protection? Was Belle Gunness just a monster of flesh, or was she a tool of a deeper machinery that thrives on human sacrifice disguised as everyday tragedy? Every corpse buried in that soil whispers the same thing. She didn't act alone. And the more you look at the patterns, the more you realize her farm was not just a personal graveyard, it was a symptom of something far more sinister hiding in plain sight. Tonight, we are going to dig deeper than the detectives ever dared, and what we find may explain why Belle Gunness never truly died, why her legend was allowed to breathe long after her farmhouse turned to ash. Because when the institutions are complicit, the monster is never really caught. To understand the darkness Belle Gunness carried, you must first see the mask she wore. To the outside world, she was a widow, a mother, a hard-working immigrant woman who had struggled through loss and tragedy. Her first husband, Mads Skrenson, conveniently died on the very day his 2 life insurance policies overlapped. Doctors wrote cerebral hemorrhage on the report, but neighbors whispered of powders, poisons, and a wife too eager to cash the checks. Then came Peter Gunness, her second husband, killed when a meat grinder supposedly fell from a shelf and crushed his skull. That explanation insulted the intelligence of anyone who heard it, yet still she collected thousands from the insurance payout. The officials nodded, the money flowed, and Belle remained untouchable. Ask yourself, how many times must fire destroy your property before suspicion becomes certainty? How many dead husbands and children must one woman bury before law enforcement acts? Yet each death was explained away, each fire insured, each tragedy filed under accident. And this is where we must peel back another layer. The institutions that should have protected the innocent were not simply negligent, they were profitable. Insurance companies grew fat on the payments of men who believed in Belle's promises, only to pay out to her when they disappeared. Banks accepted deposits from men who withdrew their life savings, never to return, while neighbors whispered but never interfered. Was this silence born of fear or of profit? Because Belle wasn't killing the destitute. She was targeting men of means, farmers, landowners, laborers with savings. Each one brought cash, bonds, or property deeds, and each one vanished. Where did that wealth go? Who helped her convert stolen savings into usable currency? Who turned their heads when Belle deposited money that could not possibly have been hers? These questions are not about Belle alone. They expose how easily corruption shields the predator when the predator feeds the system. This is the forbidden angle, the one few dare to ask. Was Belle Gunness truly a solitary killer? Or was she simply a visible face of a hidden trade in human lives? If lawmen knew she was a killer and failed to stop her, then every man buried under her hog pen was murdered twice, once by Belle, and again by the system that refused to protect him. And if Belle faked her death in 1908, as so much evidence suggests, it was not escape by chance. It was escaped by design. A design drawn up not in her kitchen but in the corridors of power. The fire that consumed. Belle's farmhouse was not an accident, it was theatre. Flames licking at the sky, smoke blotting out the stars. And inside the ruins lay the carefully staged bodies, 3 children, innocent pawns in their mother's game, and the headless corpse of a woman who was declared to be Belle Gunness. But the corpse was wrong to light, too short, missing the one piece of anatomy that could silence doubt. A body without a head is not identification. It is a message, a taunt to investigators, a final performance from a woman who had built her life on manipulation. Think about it. If Belle had orchestrated dozens of murders, butchered bodies with precision, and buried them in the soil like discarded cattle, do you believe she would leave her own body so easily found? Or was the headless woman simply another victim, another nameless soul slaughtered to create Belle's alibi? Ray Lampher, her farmhand, an occasional lover, confessed that Belle asked him to torch the house, to erase evidence, to make the world believe she had perished. Yet his words were twisted, silenced, rewritten by newspapers hungry for sensation and officials desperate to close the case. When Lampher rotted in prison, wearing the coats and watches of Belle's vanished victims, he became the perfect scapegoat. His presence in the story allowed the institutions to avoid facing the larger truth that Belle had slipped through their fingers because she was allowed to slip. Witnesses swore they saw her in Chicago. Others whispered of sightings across the Midwest, but every report was dismissed as rumor. Convenient, isn't it? A woman who stole fortunes, buried men like cattle, and vanished with the blaze of her own house is declared dead, and the case is closed. But ask yourself this: who benefits from her disappearance? If Belle were captured alive, she could have spoken of accomplices, named names, and exposed the network that allowed her farm to become a killing ground. Dead, she was silent. Declared dead, she was erased. And in erasure, the institutions saved themselves. That headless corpse was not just a body, it was a cover story. And in its absence of a face, it revealed the face of corruption hiding in plain sight. This is where the descent grows darker, because Belle's story was never just about murder. It was about manipulation, about control, about how truth itself. Now let us step into the hog pen itself, the ground that became a mass graveyard. Detectives and hired men dug into soft depressions in the soil, and what they uncovered was not simply death, but a system of disassembly. Bodies were decapitated, arms torn from shoulders, legs sawn at the knees, flesh peeled back from bone, organs gone, torsos reduced to fragments. It was a butcher's work, efficient, detached, and chillingly familiar to a woman who once worked in a slaughterhouse. Think about the psychology of that. Belle didn't kill in haste or fury. She killed with process. A system, like a machine feeding off human life. And isn't that the greater metaphor here? Society itself runs the same way. People are enticed with promises, drained of their wealth and potential, then discarded when they are no longer useful. Belle's hog pen was only the visible manifestation of a darker truth, a world where institutions operate with the same ruthless detachment, reducing men to statistics and profit margins. The victims themselves were not drifters. They were men with families, men who trusted, men who withdrew their savings to start new lives. Each letter Belle sent was bait, each promise of love and land allure. But behind her words was a deeper force, the eternal strategy of control. Entice the desperate, exploit their hopes, and bury them when they no longer serve. Ask yourself this: why were there so many trunks, coats, and possessions left behind in Belle's home? Why did neighbors see them, comment on them, and yet nothing was done? Because silence is a form of complicity. Because when corruption and profit align, eyes turn away. And while bodies rotted beneath the hog pen, the machinery above the ground kept moving, insurance companies paying, banks processing, newspapers selling stories. What happened on Belle's farm is a microcosm of the larger game. You are watching a pattern that never ended, one that still exists today, hidden in plain sight. And here lies the forbidden knowledge. Belle was not extraordinary. She was ordinary, but unleashed. She was a reflection of systems that thrive on consuming human life, stripping it to its bones, and leaving the remains in shallow graves, while the world looks away. This is why her legend was preserved, not to condemn her, but to conceal how her method mirrors the machinery of power itself. Every shovel of dirt thrown over those bodies was not just covering victims, it was burying the truth. And the deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. The letters tell us more than the graves ever could. Belle Gunness was not merely luring men, she was weaving spells through ink and paper, tapping into their deepest weaknesses. Come to my farm, bring your savings, we shall build a future together. The language was deceptively simple, but behind it lay the architecture of psychological control. She demanded secrecy, insisting they tell no one of their plans. She instructed them to withdraw money, sell property, and leave without explanation. These were not random acts of persuasion. They were calculated methods of isolation, the first step in every system of domination. Once the men severed ties with their families, they became ghosts before they were even dead. Society would not search for them because they had willingly disappeared. Their silence became her shield. Now, think carefully, doesn't this mirror the techniques of larger powers? Governments, corporations, institutions, they thrive on isolation, secrecy, and compliance. You are told to obey, to sacrifice, to trust that someone else has your best interest at heart. Belle Gunness used this same strategy not on nations, but on individuals, and the result was the same: complete control followed by complete destruction. This is why her crimes resonate beyond murder. They are a map of manipulation, a forbidden insight into how control systems strip men of their autonomy before consuming them entirely. When Assel Helgelien, the brother of one of Belle's victims, arrived to investigate, he found letters drenched in urgency and manipulation, each one a snare. And yet, when he pressed the authorities, their response was indifference until the fire forced their hand. Why? Because exposing Belle too soon would have revealed how many institutions benefited from her schemes. Every ad placed in a newspaper was revenue. Every insurance payout was a business transaction. Every vanished man represented money funneled into the system, with Belle as the executioner and the system as the accomplice. The lesson here is sharp. Murder was only the surface crime. The deeper crime was psychological enslavement, the turning of men into resources to be exploited and discarded. And in that way, Belle Gunness was not an anomaly. She was a warning. Her letters show us the mechanics of control, the very blueprint of how power manipulates hope to harvest obedience. That is why her story was suppressed, twisted, softened into folklore, because if you understand her methods, you begin to see the same machinery operating everywhere. Belle's pen was her knife long before her butcher's blade ever touched flesh. The fire should have been the end, but instead it was the beginning of the deepest riddle. The investigators sifted through the ash and rubble of the Gunness farmhouse, and what they found was not clarity, but confusion. 4 bodies lay charred, 3 children and a woman's corpse without a head. The official word was swift. Belle Gunness had perished in the flames, her reign of terror extinguished by accident or vengeance. But the evidence whispered another truth. The female body was too small, too short, too unlike the towering frame of Belle herself. Neighbors muttered about it. Assel Helgelien doubted it, and yet the sheriff wanted it closed, neat, forgotten. Why? Because closure meant protection from scandal, from lawsuits, from admitting that they had ignored the warnings until the earth itself vomited up the truth. When the farm was excavated, the soil betrayed its secrets. Bones, dozens of them, wrapped in burlap, stacked like discarded timber. Men who had walked into Belle's arms never walked back out. Dogs sniffed the graves, Townsfolk fainted at the stench, and still the officials insisted the mystery was solved. But the truth resisted burial. Witnesses reported sightings of Belle long after the fire, alive, disguised, moving through distant towns. Some said she had fled with her fortune, others that she had simply shifted her theater of cruelty elsewhere. The headless corpse was her greatest trick, a false death, a magician's escape act performed with flesh and flame. And ask yourself, why would she not? A woman capable of luring dozens of men into oblivion was certainly capable of vanishing herself, leaving only confusion behind. The unanswered question is not merely whether Belle died in that fire, but whether she transcended it, shedding her name like a snake sheds its skin. The system accepted the easy answer because the harder one, Belle alive, Belle free, Belle untouchable, was too dangerous to admit. If she could vanish under the nose of the law after slaughtering so many, what did that say about the strength of authority itself? What did it say about the value of justice? To declare her dead was not truth, but necessity. It was the lie that kept order intact. But in that lie, her legend grew. Belle Gunness did not just kill men, she killed certainty. She blurred the line between death and disappearance, leaving behind an abyss where answers should have been. And that abyss Imagine standing in the churned-up earth of Belle Gunness's farm as the investigators unearthed the bodies. One after another, a procession of skeletons rising from the soil like a grotesque harvest. The smell clung to the air, thick with rot and despair. And yet what chilled the heart more than the decay was the pattern. Each grave told the same story. Men lured by promises of love, money or land, stripped of dignity and reduced to bones in a pit. Some skeletons showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. Others bore knife marks, others still were dismembered with calculated precision. These were not the random acts of desperation. They were methodical, ritualistic, a system. And a system demands intent. Belle's killings were not born of rage or accident, but of structure, efficiency, and purpose. Here lies the forbidden truth. Belle Gunness was not simply a murderer. She was an operator of a private machine of death, a woman who understood how to convert human flesh into wealth. Letters were her bait, promises her snare, and the farm was her slaughterhouse. What the world rarely admits is that she was playing a game the institutions themselves recognized: extraction, deception, elimination. The difference was that Belle acted alone, without the sanction of government or industry. Had she worn a uniform or borne a title, her actions would not have been called crimes, but policy. Think carefully on this. Why do we recoil at Belle's system, yet accept others on larger scales? Because hers was naked, raw, unmasked. It exposed the mechanics of power into pure a form for society to stomach. And still, she thrived for years, shielded by the blindness of men who underestimated a widow, sheltered by neighbors who mistook cunning for charm, ignored by police who did not care until bodies forced them to. Every grave was a statement. Men believed themselves hunters, but in her presence, they were prey. And this truth, the reversal of roles, the exposure of vulnerability, terrified a patriarchal world that could not imagine a woman as predator. That is why her story was twisted into myth, reduced to sensational headlines of the Black Widow, rather than studied as the anatomy of control. She was not just killing, she was dismantling illusions, turning the soil of Laporte into a mirror where society glimpsed its own corruption and recoiled. Belle Gunness became a forbidden figure because she proved power could come from the shadows, and in doing so, She shattered the facade of safety that authority depends upon. The aftermath of the excavation plunged Laporte into hysteria. Crowds gathered at the farm, not to mourn the dead, but to witness the spectacle of forbidden horror. Vendors sold refreshments near the graves as if tragedy were a carnival. Souvenir hunters pried bones from the soil, stuffing them into pockets as grim trophies. Newspapers from across the nation descended like vultures, branding Belle as the Laporte ghoul, the Indiana ogress, and most famously, Hell's Belle. Yet behind the headlines, behind the mockery and thrill, was the inconvenient truth. The sheer number of men who had gone missing under her roof pointed not to chance, but to a hidden economy of trust exploited. She offered them a future, a home, companionship, even a stake in her farm. They arrived carrying cash, deeds, and possessions, only to vanish into shallow pits. This was not just murder. It was the conversion of hope into capital, the stripping of human desire for belonging into raw profit. And while the public gawked at her savagery, institutions quietly recoiled. Because Belle's crimes mirrored the very structures society pretended to uphold. Think, banks promise security yet collapse. Governments promise protection yet deliver exploitation. Belle simply enacted this betrayal at the scale of one farm. Her methods a concentrated reflection of the broader machine. That is why the official story was forced into a box spelled dead, case closed, mystery contained. To admit she might have lived, might have escaped, would mean acknowledging a predator the system could not neutralize, a woman who weaponized the same tools men in power used. The sightings after the fire whispered like a secret chorus. A woman matching her description boarding a train in Chicago. Another scene in Mississippi. Rumors of Belle living under a new name in California. Even operating boarding houses in towns where strangers disappeared without trace. Authorities dismissed them all as hysteria. But isn't denial the easiest way to bury a truth too dangerous? Ask yourself, Fifth, she could kill dozens, orchestrate disappearances, and possibly fake her death. Why would she stop there? Wouldn't she refine her craft, grow more invisible, shift her mask from widow to matron, from matron to landlady, from landlady to ghost? Belle Gunness became not just a murderer, but an archetype, a living shadow in the collective psyche, embodying the fear that evil does not end when we declare it dead. It adapts, it survives, and perhaps it still walks among us. But let us cut deeper into the anatomy of this shadow, because Belle Gunness was never merely one woman. She was a manifestation of a system of control wearing flesh. Look at the pattern. She targeted men in transition, migrants, widowers, dreamers, chasing a new life in America. These were men disconnected from their roots, men untethered from kin, the perfect prey because their disappearances would raise no immediate alarm. It was not coincidence. It was strategy. Belle was reading the fault lines of society and exploiting them with surgical precision. In her letters, she mirrored their desires back to them. Companionship, land, stability. She became the voice of their longing, the mirror of their fantasies. This is how psychological control works, not by brute force, but by capturing what someone already wants and twisting it until it becomes the instrument of their destruction. When her suitors entered the farmhouse, they were not walking into a stranger's home, they were stepping into the architecture of their own manipulated desire. That is why they did not run. That is why they stayed, even when unease whispered. And this technique, though brutal in her hands, is the same one used by institutions cloaked in legitimacy. Governments promise freedom while drafting laws that chain. Corporations promise prosperity while siphoning wealth. Churches promise salvation while hoarding guilt. Each mirrors back what the believer craves, then buries them in the soil of exploitation. Belle's farm was a miniature reflection of this machinery and unauthorized reproduction of power's grand theater. And that is why she was so terrifying. Not because she killed, but because she revealed the design, that trust itself is the most dangerous weapon when wielded by those without conscience. The graves on her property did not merely contain the bones of men. They contained the proof that belief, when corrupted, becomes a noose. This is what society could not allow to be fully spoken, because if people saw Belle's system for what it truly was, they might begin to see the larger structures around them with equal clarity. And once you see the machine, you cannot unsee it. Belle Gunness, the so-called widow of Laporte, was not an aberration of history, but its mirror. A forbidden echo reminding us that the predators are not always in shadows, they are often seated in the very institutions, we're told. The newspapers painted Belle as a grotesque spectacle, a monstrous anomaly, a woman whose savagery made her less than human. But this too was a form of control of Belle, was portrayed as a freak, an exception to all rules. Then society could rest easy believing she was an isolated nightmare. Yet the evidence suggests otherwise. She was not an accident of evil. She was a student of human weakness. Every advertisement she placed, every letter she crafted, was designed with chilling calculation. She spoke the language of longing better than any preacher, better than any banker, better than any politician. And that should disturb you, because what Belle practiced on lonely men in Indiana is the same psychological script still performed in every arena of power. The difference was that Belle's stage was a farmhouse and her curtain was fire. The system's stage is the nation. Its curtain is history itself. Consider how she used silence as much as words. Once a man arrived at her farm, he was cut off from his world. No family nearby, no one to check on him. Isolation is the oldest tool of control remove, the victim from all competing voices until the predator's voice is the only one left. That same pattern lives in how cults indoctrinate, how regimes silence, how corporations monopolize. It is the narrowing of the field of vision until the prey no longer sees an escape. Belle mastered this instinctively, but what makes her story forbidden is not the murders. It is how clearly her system exposes the fragility of human autonomy when confronted with engineered trust. And look at the reaction. The town of Laporte, once so proud of its immigrant farms and booming industry, recoiled into denial. They wanted to believe Belle was a monster who had died in the fire because the alternative that she walked away. Unseen, unfoundment, the system they trusted, was not only blind, but complicit. The sheriff's quick closure, the coroner's contradictions, the unanswered questions about the headless body all point to an institutional instinct not for truth, but for containment. When the soil of her farm erupted with bones, society itself was standing over a mirror. And rather than confront the reflection, they chose to turn away, to declare her gone, to seal the story in ink and ashes. But you and I, we will not turn away, because what they buried with Belle Gunness was not only her victims, it was a revelation about power, deception, and the terrifying thinness of the line between order and chaos. The deeper you descend into Belle Gunness's legacy, the clearer it becomes that her farmhouse was not just a crime scene, it was an altar. Every body she buried was part of a ritual of power, not in the mystical sense, but in the psychological architecture of control. Think of it, Men came willingly, hopeful, filled with dreams of ownership, companionship, belonging. She stripped those dreams, extracted their wealth, and then planted their remains into the soil like seeds. That farm was fed by human ambition, watered by trust, and harvested in fear. And like any altar, it had a congregation not of worshippers, but of enablers. The neighbors who noticed suitors arriving and never leaving but said nothing. The postal service that delivered letter after letter, watching a widow conduct what looked like a business of attraction. The local officials who ignored her odd patterns until the fire forced their hand. Silence was her accomplice, and society itself became her shield. This is what forbidden history always reveals. The criminal may be singular, but the complicity is collective. Ask yourself, how many crimes today remain hidden not because they are subtle, but because too many people benefit from not seeing? Belle's crimes remained buried for years because those around her found comfort in ignorance. That ignorance was safety, and safety was cheaper than truth. But the fire shattered the illusion. As investigators uncovered more skeletons, whispers began to spread. What if she had not perished in the blaze? What if she had orchestrated the fire, staged her death, and fled with her fortune? The missing head of the woman's corpse became a symbol of that possibility, a haunting gap that refused to be closed. In that silence, Belle transformed into something more dangerous than a killer. She became an absence, a question mark that lingered across the nation. People began to see her everywhere, in crowded train stations, in boarding houses, in towns where strangers vanished. Was it paranoia or proof? The truth is, both possibilities served the same purpose: to remind America that certainty is fragile, that evil can dissolve into smoke and reappear in the next town over. Belle Gunness's altar may have been reduced to ashes, but her ritual, the conversion of trust into control, and the most disturbing thought is this: perhaps Belle never died because the system she mirrored never died. It still walks among us, feeding, hiding, thriving. The fire that consumed Belle Gunness's farmhouse was not the end, it was the rebirth of her myth. As investigators scraped through the ruins, they stumbled upon a body that was supposed to be hers, but it was too small, too light, and crucially, headless. Think about that. A woman of Belle's size, reduced suddenly to a corpse that didn't match her dimensions, missing the most identifiable feature, her face. Coincidence? Or the final masterstroke of a woman who had built her life on deception? The coroner testified to the discrepancies, yet the official record leaned toward convenience. Belle Gunness is dead. But ask yourself, who benefited from that declaration? The sheriff avoided public panic, the press had a headline to sell, and the town could wrap its nightmare in closure. Yet closure without truth is poison. And as word spread, sightings of Belle began to surface across the Midwest. A woman matching her size and features boarding trains, renting rooms, speaking with an accent. Witnesses swore it was her, but none of them could prove it. What unsettled people most wasn't the possibility of her survival, it was the realization that they couldn't know for sure. This is how psychological control works. It's not just about what a killer does to her victims. It's about what she does to everyone else, leaving them uncertain, questioning, unable to trust their own eyes. And Belle mastered that game, even in supposed death. Look at the timing. A victim's brother had threatened to come searching for his missing sibling right before the fire. Suddenly, the farmhouse burned, a body was found, and Belle was gone. Was this desperation or strategy? Ray Lampher, her farmhand and lover, later claimed she had orchestrated everything, using him as a disposable pawn. His confessions painted Belle as a predator too intelligent to die in her own trap. But Lamphere himself was unstable, a man caught between obsession and guilt. Was he speaking truth, or ensuring Belle's legend survived? Here's the forbidden truth. Whether she lived or died in 1908 didn't matter. By removing certainty, Belle transcended mortality. She became an archetype, the widow who could be anywhere, the predator who could be anyone. That is why men feared answering letters, why women feared widows with sudden wealth, why neighbors wondered about their own farms. Belle Gunness created a legacy of unease, a reminder that monsters don't need to haunt us from beyond the grave when they can The investigators who dug through the Gunness farm thought they were solving a crime. But what they uncovered was a system of human disposal so calculated it rivaled the coldness of industrial slaughterhouses. Bodies were not just buried, they were disassembled, stripped of identity, transformed into fragments of flesh and bone, wrapped in burlap like common refuse. Skulls split, limbs severed, torsos hacked into unrecognizable pieces. To the public, this brutality was framed as the work of a deranged widow. But step back, and it looks disturbingly systematic. Belle's time working in a butcher shop taught her more than how to cut meat. It trained her in how to depersonalize flesh, to reduce life into parts. This was not chaos, it was efficiency. And efficiency is always the signature of something larger than one person's madness. Think about the men who arrived on her farm. They came with money, with letters of promise in their pockets, and with a fatal flaw, trust. Their names were erased, their bodies fragmented, their lives folded into Belle's financial ascent. And as the investigators uncovered more trunks in her home, more belongings left behind, the truth emerged: her victims were never meant to leave. Her farm was a machine, a black hole disguised as a home. But here's the part that history rarely whispers. The remains they found were only the ones buried close to the farmhouse. Shallow graves under the hog pen, near the outhouse, by the lake. What if there were more, scattered farther, hidden deeper? How many lives did she erase that will never be counted? Officially, they say at least 14. Some estimates rise toward 40. But numbers mean nothing without acknowledgement, and the town of LaPorte quickly turned from horror to spectacle. Tourists arrive by train, walking through the grounds as if visiting a carnival. Vendors sold postcards, souvenirs, relics of death. The farm of horrors became an attraction, a marketplace of tragedy. This is the forbidden layer of Belle's story. America commodified her murders. The town profited from the graves. Newspapers cashed in on her legend. The system that ignored her crimes in life used her atrocities in death to sell tickets, to move papers, to fuel gossip. And so Belle won twice: first, by feeding her greed with human lives, then by becoming an icon that transformed death into commerce. Tell me, who truly buried those victims, the widow with her shovel, or the society that turned their suffering into entertainment? What made Belle Gunness so dangerous was not just her strength, not just her cunning, but her mastery of masks. She was never simply one person. She was whatever her victims needed her to be. To the lonely immigrant farmer, she was security and companionship. To the grieving widower, she was a motherly presence who understood loss. To her neighbors, she was the hard-working widow, a woman who survived tragedy after tragedy with stoic resilience. And to the institutions, the banks, the insurance companies, the police, she was respectable enough to avoid suspicion. That is the hidden genius of predators. They thrive not in the shadows, but in plain sight, using society's own stereotypes as camouflage. Belle understood that widows occupied a unique space in America's moral landscape, trusted, untouchable. Her tragedy became her shield. She wore grief like armor, and with it, she built a fortress no man questioned entering. But the cracks were always there. Her first husband's sudden death, perfectly timed to overlap to insurance policies, the candy store fire, the burned house, the infants who died though she was never visibly pregnant. Each event was written off as bad luck, a string of misfortunes. Yet how many misfortunes must occur before coincidence rots into conspiracy? This is where institutional corruption creeps in. Not corruption in the form of payoffs or bribes, but in willful blindness. The system thrives when people play their roles. Belle played hers so perfectly that no one dared question the narrative. Officials looked the other way because to confront the truth would mean confronting their own incompetence. And so her mask remained intact until fire stripped it away. But even then, even with bodies unearthed and evidence piled high, the myth of Belle, the grieving widow, clung stubbornly. Some newspapers still painted her as a mother who died trying to save her children. That's how deep the mask had sunk, so deep it became part of the cultural imagination. And here is the forbidden lesson. Masks like Belle's still exist. They are worn by killers, yes, but also by leaders, institutions, entire systems. Masks designed to pacify, to manipulate, to harvest trust. Belle Gunness was not only a murderer, she was a mirror, reflecting how easy it is for power to wear innocence. How easily the world accepts the performance and ignores the cost. As the investigation unfolded, the figure of Ray Lampher emerged like a ghost tethered to Belle's shadow. He was her hired hand, her occasional lover, and perhaps her most expendable pawn. When the fire consumed the farmhouse, Lampher was immediately cast as the villain accused of arson, whispered to have been jealous, painted as the unstable man scorned by a manipulative widow. But history reveals a darker layer. Lampher confessed, yes, but his words were fractured, contradictory, reshaped by journalists, ministers, and opportunists who each wanted their own version of truth. In one account, he admitted that Belle had ordered him to torch the house with her children inside, a final act of cleansing before she vanished. In another, he insisted the body found was not Belle at all, that she had planted a substitute corpse and disappeared into the night. Which account was true? Both? Neither? This is where the corruption of narrative begins. The justice system needed closure, so Lampher became the scapegoat, the perfect foil to Belle's myth. He was convicted of arson but not murder, yet his name became synonymous with her crimes. By pinning blame on Lampher, authorities could shield themselves from deeper scrutiny. After all, how had Belle operated in plain sight for decades without being stopped? It was easier to tell the public a story of a crazed handyman than to admit that the system itself had failed, that its blindness had allowed Belle to thrive. But Lampher's confessions still linger, pulsing with unresolved dread. If Belle truly staged her death, then every moment after 1908 became part of her design. Each sighting, each rumor, each whisper in the Midwest that she had been seen boarding a train or running a boarding house fueled the fire of uncertainty. And here lies the forbidden truth. Uncertainty is more powerful than certainty. A dead killer cannot haunt you. A living one, unbound and unseen, turns every stranger into a possible predator. Belle became less of a person and more of an idea, reminder that evil can smile, take your hand, and vanish without trace. Lampher may have been guilty, but he was not the architect. He was a discarded tool, left behind so that Belle could melt into history. And in doing so, she ensured her survival not just in flesh, but in legend. The confession that Lampher gave to Reverend Edwin Skell, sealed away in a safe and later published, only deepened the shadows. It was inconsistent, shifting, almost dreamlike in its contradictions. In one breath, he painted Belle as a cold-blooded butcher who ordered death without hesitation. In another, he spoke of her as a woman consumed by fear, desperate to erase her trail before the walls closed in. But think carefully. Was Lampher confessing truth, or was he reciting the script Belle had planted in his mind? Manipulation was her weapon, and even in absence, she wielded it like a blade. The more he spoke, the more tangled the story became, until fact and fabrication were indistinguishable. This is the power of psychological control. Doesn't just silence victims. It rewires the witnesses. It corrupts testimony until the record itself becomes a labyrinth. And what better way to ensure immortality than by leaving behind a story no one can resolve? Institutions fed on this confusion. Journalists published conflicting accounts. Churches sought moral lessons in the chaos. And lawmen used the ambiguity to escape accountability. Meanwhile, families of the vanished men received no closure, no bodies to bury, no certainty of fate. Their grief was stretched across years, decades, transformed into an open wound that never healed. That is the legacy of Belle Gunness, not just the bodies, but the psychological scars inflicted on those left behind. Consider this. If Belle had truly died in the fire, the myth would have ended there. But by introducing doubt, by leaving a headless corpse, by ensuring contradictions in Lampher's words, she weaponized uncertainty itself. That uncertainty infected the public like a disease. Every farm widow became suspicious. Every letter from a stranger became a threat. Every unexplained disappearance was whispered to be Belle's work. She escaped the farm, yes, but more importantly, she escaped the boundaries of history. She became folklore, a spectre of trust betrayed, and once someone becomes folklore, they cannot be killed. They live on in every retelling, every rumor, every shiver of fear when the lights go out. And so the question isn't whether Lampher's confession was true. The question is whether truth was ever meant to survive Belle Gunness, at Ore, if she... By now, you can see that Belle Gunness was not just killing men, she was dissecting society itself, exposing its weaknesses with every shovel of dirt. She preyed on loneliness, on desperation, on the male urge to build, to own, to control land and lineage. Her advertisements were bait not simply for wealth, but for the very psychology of men who wanted to carve their place in America's expanding frontier. They came willingly, blinded by hope, and were consumed by a woman who understood their hunger better than they did. But here is the forbidden truth. Belle's farm was not an isolated horror. It was a reflection of a culture where lives could be traded, erased, or discarded as long as money flowed. Think about the insurance companies that paid her again and again without question. Think about the newspapers that glamorized her as a tragic widow even after the first bodies were found. Think about the officials who ignored patterns of death because confronting them meant unraveling the illusion of order. Every institution around her, whether by negligence or convenience, became an accomplice. And when the farm was finally exposed, did they reckon with their complicity? No, they monetized it. Tourists swarmed the ruins, buying snacks and souvenirs, gawking at the churned soil that still bled secrets. The very ground where men had screamed their last became a carnival. This is how corruption hides in plain sight, not as overt evil, but as entertainment, as commerce, as distraction. Society consumed Belle's crimes the way she consumed her victims, with appetite, with indifference, with greed. And in that cycle, Belle achieved something rare among killers. She became untouchable, even in exposure, because the more her crimes were discussed, the more powerful her myth grew. The more contradictions in her story, the less resolution there could be. And without resolution, there is only fascination. Ask yourself, how many other Belle Gunnesses has history buried beneath spectacle? How many other crimes were transmuted into myths, stripped of accountability, and sold back to the public as folklore? That is the danger of forbidden history, not that it hides from us, but that it is disguised as entertainment so that we consume it without ever recognizing it as truth. Belle's shadow is not just in Laporte. It is in every story that distracts us from asking who benefits when truth is left buried. And the answer is always the same. The system feeds while the victims rot in silence. The truth is, Belle Gunness's murders cannot be contained within the walls of her farmhouse, nor within the shallow graves of her orchard. They extend outward, seeping into the way we understand trust, power, and human vulnerability. She was not just a woman killing for money, she was a mirror, reflecting the darkest truths about the American dream. That dream promised prosperity to all who worked, but what did it really deliver? A ruthless competition where the weak were discarded and the desperate made reckless bargains. Belle embodied that ruthlessness perfectly. She didn't play by the rules of love, marriage, or morality. She rewrote them for survival and domination. That is why her story still unsettles us more than a century later. Because beneath the surface horror of her crimes is the deeper horror of recognition. We see in her the logical conclusion of a system that rewards cunning, deception, and brutality. She learned early that men could be manipulated if you spoke to their desires, and that institutions would look the other way if you kept the money flowing. She did not kill out of passion or rage. She killed because it was efficient, and efficiency is the language of modern power. Think of how corporations strip workers of dignity in the name of profit. Think of how governments wage wars where bodies pile up but contracts are signed and wealth is generated. What Belle did on a small farm in Indiana is not so different in principle. That is why she haunts us. She is not an outlier. She is an exaggerated version of something we already live with. Her farm was America in miniature. Hopeful arrivals lured by promises, consumed and discarded into the dirt, while others looked away. And just as Belle's farm became a spectacle after her disappearance, so too does our society turn human suffering into spectacle today. Crime scenes become Netflix series. Murders become podcasts. The blood of the past becomes entertainment for the present. We are complicit in the same cycle that shielded Belle, because fascination without accountability is another form of silence. So when you hear her name, do not just imagine the woman with a shovel and a fire. Imagine the world that built her, the world that still thrives on the same logic of consumption and erasure. Belle Gunness was not only a killer, she was a prophecy. And whether we accept it or not, her shadow stretches into our own time, daring us to ask, how much blood has already been buried under the stories we choose to tell ourselves? The night Belle Gunness vanished, fire consuming her farmhouse in a blaze that turned sky into ash The world should have found closure. A body was discovered, burned beyond recognition, believed by many to be Belle's. But even then, even in the smoking rubble, the contradictions refused to settle. The corpse found was far too small, lacking Belle's towering frame and heavy build. Some claimed it was the body of a housekeeper or one of Belle's own victims, staged to look like her final resting place. If true, then Belle had outsmarted everyone one last time, faking her death, escaping into the night, and leaving behind only questions. What kind of woman walks away from her crimes unpunished, unrepentant, with nothing but silence to shield her? The answer is one who understands human blindness. Investigators were divided, the press intoxicated by the scandal, and the public eager for an ending that absolved them of looking too closely. Declaring Belle dead was convenient. It gave the community a sense of closure and allowed institutions to move on without reckoning with their failure to stop her. But the doubts never died. For decades afterward, sightings of Belle were whispered like ghost stories. She was reportedly seen in Chicago, then in New York, even as far as Los Angeles Soulways, a woman who looked too much like her, always accompanied by rumors of missing men. Was it her? Or was it simply the legend of Belle Gunness, kept alive by the fear that she had slipped beyond justice? The uncertainty is more terrifying than any confirmed truth, because it means her story was never really over. And here lies the deeper horror. Belle's disappearance is not just a question of identity, but of accountability. If she faked her death, she revealed how fragile the machinery of justice really is. How easily the system can be deceived by confidence and spectacle. Her fire erased evidence, her legend erased responsibility, and all that was left was a ghost haunting the margins of history. Ask yourself how many others have done the same. How many crimes are buried beneath official stories that tie things up neatly, so we don't have to face the abyss of what we cannot explain? Belle Gunness may have been a farmer's widow with a shovel, but she left behind something far larger, a crack in the illusion of order. The fire at her farm did not mark the end of her story. It marked the beginning of an unresolved curse, one that forces us to confront how much darkness is hidden when society craves certainty more than truth. The legend of Belle Gunness endures because it was never properly closed, and legends like hers become more dangerous than facts. A burned body that didn't match her size, a fire set with precision, and the sudden disappearance of a woman who had mastered manipulation. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms of something larger, a life lived entirely in deception. Belle was not simply killing men. She was staging narratives, building illusions, controlling perception like a master of psychological warfare. Every letter she sent to lure her victims was crafted as if she was scripting a play, knowing her audience would suspend disbelief because they wanted the promise of wealth, marriage, or companionship to be real. When the fire came, she wrote her final act. One more trick, one more escape, one more rewriting of her role in history. Think about the weight of that power, not the brute force of a murderer, but the silent command of a storyteller who bends reality to her will. Isn't that what all systems of control do? They don't need chains if they can control the story. Governments write histories that erase atrocities. Churches preach forgiveness while burying scandals. Corporations sell hope while draining lives. Belle did the same on her small Indiana farm, offering men the story they wanted to believe until they became part of her buried archive of bones. This is why her name feels immortal. She doesn't rest in a grave because her myth is too useful, too unsettling, too resonant with the way the world actually works. Whether she died in that fire or vanished into the shadows is almost irrelevant. What matters is that her unresolved ending keeps her alive, whispering in the back of our minds that justice is never absolute, that evil often escapes, and that truth is always negotiable. And that whisper is dangerous because it undermines the illusion we cling to that the guilty are always caught, that stories have tidy resolutions, that the darkness of the past stays in the past. Belle Gunness is proof that none of this is true. She forces us to live with the possibility that the monster walked away smiling, free, blending into the crowds of a new city, perhaps watching from the corner as history turned her crimes into legend. The fire at her farmhouse wasn't just an escape, it was a warning flare shot into time itself. If Belle Gunness truly escaped, then every life she claimed becomes more than a statistic, it becomes unfinished business. Imagine the families who waited for letters that never came, who suspected betrayal but could never prove it, who wondered if their sons, brothers, or fathers had simply abandoned them. The truth was far darker. Their loved ones were reduced to bones and ash, buried beneath hog pens and orchard dirt. But because Belle's own fate was uncertain, those families were denied even the cold satisfaction of justice. Their grief was doubled, their wounds left unclosed. This is the true cruelty of her legacy. She didn't just kill bodies, she murdered certainty. That power, to erase not only lives but also answers, is why she stands apart from other killers. Her crime scene was not just her farm, it was history itself. She infected it with ambiguity, and ambiguity breeds obsession. That's why her story has been retold for more than a century. Not just as a tale of murder, but as a riddle that gnaws at our need for resolution. And it's not accidental. By burning her farmhouse, Belle weaponized mystery. She understood that a mystery is more enduring than a confession, more haunting than a verdict. Think of how cult leaders, corrupt politicians, and secret societies thrive not by answering questions, but by multiplying them. Control comes not from clarity, but from confusion. Belle mastered this. She didn't need to stand trial, because her greatest trial was fought in the minds of the public, where she remains guilty and innocent at once, dead and alive at once, human and myth all at once. The duality makes her timeless. She is not just a killer of men. She is a killer of certainty. And in a world built on illusions of safety and order, that is far more terrifying. So when we look at her story now, over 100 years later, we are forced to ask ourselves, how many Belle Gunnesses walk among us today, cloaked in ambiguity, unpunished because their crimes are buried in fire and ash, their identities dissolved into doubt. Belle's story is not an isolated horror, it is a mirror showing us that justice is fragile, truth is malleable, and monsters do not always vanish when the fire goes out. They sometimes step through the smoke and walk quietly into another life, carrying with them the silence of the dead. The deeper you look at Belle Gunness, the more her crimes feel less like isolated murders and more like a philosophy in motion. She thrived in an America defined by expansion, greed, and survival of the fittest, and she absorbed those lessons with brutal clarity. Men came to her farm dreaming of wealth, of love, of permanence, and she turned those dreams into their graves. But isn't that the same pattern society itself repeats? Offer promises, lure the desperate, extract everything of value, and discard the remains. Belle's genius, if such a word can be used in the shadow of her horrors, was her ability to compress the ruthless logic of a nation into the soil of her land. That is why her backyard became a mass grave, because it symbolized not only her hunger, but the hunger of a system that rewards predators. And her escape, if true, becomes even more sinister, because it suggests she understood the system well enough to disappear inside it, like smoke dispersing into the air. No body means no proof. No proof means no closure. And without closure, the myth survives stronger than the person ever could. That is why Belle feels immortal, because she left behind uncertainty rather than resolution. This immortality is not supernatural. It is psychological. She carved herself into the human imagination as the woman who devoured men and vanished. And that image has more power than any trial or execution could have given her. The story of Belle Gunness forces you to question the way the world itself operates. How many tragedies are hidden beneath the surface of respectability? How many bodies are buried under the weight of progress? How many killers go unpunished because their disappearance is more convenient than their capture? Belle reminds us that evil often thrives, not because it is invisible, but because it wears the mask of order, the mask of narrative, the mask of inevitability. And as you sit with that thought, you begin to see her not just as a woman who murdered dozens, but as an omen. She is the shadow in every promise too good to be true, the silence in every institution that refuses accountability, the ghost of every system that devours its believers. Belle Gunness is gone, but the world she revealed is not. It is still here, around you, waiting, hungry, and smiling. And now we reach the end, or rather, the place where the trail of bones disappears into smoke. Belle Gunness, the widow of Indiana, the woman who turned her farm into a cemetery, leaves us with nothing but fragments, bodies without names, a fire without answers, a story without resolution. Yet perhaps that is her truest crime, forcing us to confront a world where closure is an illusion. She reminds us that some mysteries are designed not to be solved, but to be endured. Her legend endures because it speaks to something primal in us, the fear that the predators of this world are not punished, that they slip through the cracks, and that the soil beneath our feet hides more secrets than we will ever know. Belle becomes more than herself. She becomes a cipher, a warning, a reflection of how institutions can fail, how human hunger can be weaponized, and how easily trust can be corrupted. When you think of her, you are not only thinking of a woman with a shovel and a ledger of promises. You are thinking of every false narrative you have ever been sold, every betrayal hidden behind a smile, every truth burned in fire so only silence remains. She is not only a historical figure, she is a symbol of unresolved horror that refuses to die. And that is why you are here now, listening, drawn into this descent, because deep down you recognize that her shadow is not contained in the past, it is alive in the present. You have followed me through this darkness, through the bones and the fire, through the lies and the silence, and now you stand at the edge of a truth that does not comfort, but wounds. Belle Gunness is more than an unsolved case, she is a mirror. And the question is not whether she escaped justice, but whether we will ever escape the system that created her. If this journey has unsettled you, if it has forced you to look at the world differently, then you understand why her name must not be forgotten. So I leave you with this. Remember her story not as entertainment, but as revelation. And if you are ready to keep descending with me into the forbidden truths the world hides, then like this video, share it with those who need to wake up, and subscribe for more, because the past is not dead, is buried, waiting.